Dr. Russell Buchan. I'm a lecturer in international law at the School of Law here at the University of Sheffield. Welcome to the 2014 Warrender Lecture, which is hosted this year by the Department of Politics and the School of Law here at the University of Sheffield. Ordinarily, the Warrender Lecture is an important event in the research calendar of the Department of Politics. But this year, in order to celebrate closer cooperation, indeed hopefully foster greater cooperation in the future between our departments, the Department of Politics and the School of Law are hosting this event collaboratively. Before I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, there's a couple of thank yous that I'd like to make first of all, both by myself and on behalf of Garrett too. First, to the International Law Association, the ILA, which has provided generous financial support in order to enable us to host this event this evening. A requirement of the funding that they provide us is that I say a few words to advertise and promote the ILA, which is a good thing. In short, the objective of the International Law Association is to promote research into private and public international law. I encourage everybody to visit the ILA's website. It's an excellent resource for private and public international law. And for a small fee, a reasonable fee, I believe you can become a member too. Second, to the Politics Department, and in particular its Centre for Political Theory and Global Justice, and to the School of Law, for the Centre for International and European Law, both financially and administratively provided indispensable support for the lecture this evening. Thirdly, perhaps most importantly, to the students and to the student societies, the numerous student societies that have helped promote and advertise this lecture this evening, so the Exchange, the Politics Society, the Edward Bramley Law Society, and also the Sheffield Debating Society. So thank you to you. We're very grateful to have with us this evening our speaker, Mary Ellen O'Connell, who is the Robert and Marion Short Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, United States of America. Professor O'Connell is an internationally renowned expert in international law, and in particular international legal theory and international legal framework relating to the use of force. Naturally, Professor O'Connell has published extensively in these fields, authoring monographs, compiling edited collections, and authoring numerous seminal research articles in leading law journals. In addition, Mary Ellen O'Connell has held and continues to hold prestigious appointments and positions in the international legal world, including previously the Vice President of the American Society of International Law and the Chair of the International Law Association's Use of Force Committee, and for the 2014-2015 academic year, a Senior Law Fellow at the Centre for Theological Inquiry at Princeton. Furthermore, Professor O'Connell is one of the few scholars whose academic work has had a direct and profound impact upon policy and policymakers, and in particular upon the US administration's use of drones, which will at least in part be the topic of discussion for this evening's lecture. If I understand correctly, Professor O'Connell will lecture for approximately 35 to 40 minutes, leaving approximately 25 minutes for question and answers that will be coordinated by Garrett from the Politics Department. I should note that after the lecture at 7:35, the Debating Society will be holding a debate related to Professor O'Connell's talk entitled "This House Would Ban American Drone Strikes in Pakistan." And for those of you that want to join the Debating Society for that are very welcome. The title of Professor O'Connell's lecture is "The Future of Weapons and War," and I'm sure you'll all join me in welcoming Professor O'Connell to the lectern.
Well, I'm really delighted to be speaking at Sheffield tonight. Russell Buchan has been a good friend for a number of years. It is thanks to him that I got pushed into thinking about other weapon systems beyond drones. He really thought I should start thinking about cyber weapons, and he was right, and I have, and I'll talk about those somewhat tonight, as well. And from cyber weapons, it's a short step to another topic that Sheffield is world famous with respect to, and that's fully autonomous robotic weapons. And I've become a good colleague and close friend of Noah Sharkey from this university as well. So I'll talk about all three of those areas of weapons when we're talking about the future of weapons. And then I want to speculate with you a bit on the way we're regulating the use of those weapons and how they may impact our future understanding of this phenomenon we know as war. So my remarks this evening concern developments with respect to new high-tech weapons and the impact that these weapons and our regulation of them are likely to have on the future of war. The weapons I want to discuss, as I've just said, are first of all drones, which are unmanned aerial, land, and sea launch vehicles, cyber weapons, which are computer programs designed to have a destructive capacity, and the newest category, fully autonomous weapon systems, which are robotic weapons programmed to select and attack targets without further human intervention after the initial programming of the robot. Some commentators in international security, and I'm sure many of you are aware of these commentators, have stated publicly that they are unaware of any international law relevant to the use of these weapons. And other commentators who are aware of international legal rules make the very strong argument that there should be no international law limiting the use of at least certain countries, principally the United States, from having resort to them. International law, of course, has rules about the use of the deployment of any lethal weapon, and moreover, international law is uniquely well qualified to be the means through which humanity effectively and appropriately regulates the use of such weapons. The history of arms control efforts suggests that total elimination of weapon systems that are already invented is very unlikely. And I also doubt whether we can even convince countries to stop research into the three categories of weapons I just mentioned. Nevertheless, through international law, there is hope for creating strict limits on their use. And this can be achieved in two ways through international law. First, through the traditional method of treaties, but also indirectly in terms of how we interpret the legal principle of necessity, the principle governing the necessity to resort to military force. And the way that we deal with these weapons going forward will, I submit to you tonight, have an influence on the future of war. War can potentially become even more common, so common that we will come to think of war and the deployment of military force as the normal situation and peace as the exception. However, if we carefully regulate these weapons, if we apply in a more robust form current rules, we could go in the opposite direction, making the phenomenon of war very rare indeed. Let me begin approaching these propositions with some more facts about the three new types of weapons, and then the current law under which their use is regulated, before turning to the trends indicating either this all war, all the time future, or a future of predominant peace. Arguably, the first major revolution in military weapons development since the advent of the nuclear weapon is the computer. Computers have revolutionized warfighting, of course, in many ways, but computer-controlled unmanned launch vehicles are the weapons part of the revolution. The United States developed a drone at the end of World War II, or soon thereafter. Drones were used for reconnaissance purposes in the Vietnam War, the 1990-91 Gulf War, the Balkans conflicts of 1991 to 1999, and all wars since. But by the year 2000, in the Clinton administration, the U.S. had weaponized its reconnaissance drone to carry the Hellfire missile. The Hellfire missile is a tank-killing weapon. It is lawful for use in hostilities only. In 2007, the U.S. began improving on its Predator drone fleet by purchasing the Reaper drone. The Reaper drone was designed from the beginning to be an attack drone. It is similar in design and function to the Predator, but it is more heavily armed. The Predator carries only 2 Hellfire missiles. The Reaper carries 14. The Reaper can also carry bombs weighing up to 500 pounds. And now the U.S. is moving on from its Reaper fleet to its new, larger and faster drone called the Avenger, which I think is a slight improvement on the name. The first use of a drone in a lethal operation occurred in November 2001 in Afghanistan. In general, drone use in Afghanistan during combat operations is as lawful as using manned aircraft to drop bombs or fire missiles. Beyond combat zones, however, it is unlawful to use drones that launch missiles for targeted assassinations. Nevertheless, in November 2002, the US CIA carried out just such killings using a drone far from the battlefields of Afghanistan. The attack was launched from the former French colony of Djibouti on Africa's east coast. The drone launched 2 Hellfire missiles at a passenger vehicle traveling along a road in a remote part of Yemen. 6 persons were killed, including a 23-year-old American from upstate New York. The U.S. Air Force, which controlled the U.S. drone fleet at the time, had refused to carry out the attack. They said that there were serious legal problems with the use of lethal force in such a situation. The American CIA, however, had no such qualms. The CIA had been taken out of all lethal operations following its disastrous history of killing in the Vietnam War and in the Central American dirty wars of the 1980s. But after 9/11, President Bush signed waivers allowing the CIA to return to a number of tasks that it had no longer carried out, including detention, interrogation, and lethal operations. The CIA agents involved in the killings in Yemen in 2002 were able to fly in a helicopter from Djibouti to the scene of the drone attack, to rappel down from the helicopters, and to take DNA samples from the victims and return to base. That indicates to you, I think, just how peaceful, non-conflictual the situation was around where the drone was used to kill these individuals. And indeed, in January 2003, Asma Jahangir, the UN Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Killings, made a report to the United Nations in which she stated that the November 2002 drone attack in Yemen was clearly an extrajudicial, unlawful killing. Nevertheless, the CIA forged ahead. In 2004, it began its campaign of targeted killing in Pakistan, and in late 2006 carried out similar attacks, probably with the US military, in Somalia. Today, new drone bases are being constructed which indicate the US has plans for using lethal drone operations beyond the 3 countries I've just mentioned and 3 other countries where the US has been involved in armed conflict, hostilities since 9/11. 6 countries where it has used drones to attack. According to the United Kingdom's Bureau of Investigative Journalism, by the end of 2013, the U.S. had killed as many as 4,100 people beyond armed conflict zones using drones, and within that number, over 200 children. Of course, by now, we are all aware that other countries are establishing their own drone bases, and that there is interest by non-state actor groups in acquiring drones as well. And most worrying of all, we're seeing increasing indications by other countries and groups in using drones similarly to the way the CIA has been using them beyond armed conflict zones. The New York Times carried a front-page article in September 2013 with the headline, "Hacking U.S. Secrets, China Pushes for Drones." China has apparently accessed computers of companies that have developed U.S. drone technology, and the New York Times reports that in September, Chinese officials sent a drone near the disputed islands administered by Japan. The Chinese have debated using a weaponized drone in 2012 to kill a criminal suspect in Myanmar, and the Chinese are very active selling drones resembling the Predator, the American model, to other countries for less than $1 million each. The attack drone arms race is well underway. Cyber weapons are another new invention of the computer age. Like unmanned systems, they appeal certainly to the United States presidents because they are cheaper and lower profile than conventional weapons. The first significant use of a cyber weapon was the Stuxnet worm, developed and most likely released by the United States and Israel in 2009. Stuxnet was intended to slow the progress of Iran's nuclear program. Stuxnet is a computer program malware designed to infiltrate programs used by computers manufactured by the German company Siemens and used by the Iranians to develop their nuclear program. In January 2010, investigators with the International Atomic Energy Agency noticed that there was something wrong with the Iranian centrifuges at its nuclear facilities. Iranian scientists were replacing the centrifuges at many times the normal rate. The IAEA discovered that in 2009, a virus had infiltrated the Iranian computers, causing the centrifuges to turn far too rapidly and causing some breakdown. The IAEA concluded that the malware used to have this effect on Iranian computers was the most complex ever written. In early 2011, officials in Israel and the U.S. announced that Iran's nuclear program had been set back by several years. In fact, it was probably only several months. Moreover, the Stuxnet worm affected many computers outside of Iran, in Europe, in Russia, Indonesia, India, and other places. It's thought that about 40% of all the computers affected by Stuxnet were outside Iran. Stuxnet, however, has been described as the first known worm designed to target real-world infrastructure such as power stations, water plants, and industrial units to damage them. Ralph Langer, a German computer security expert, is convinced that Stuxnet was intended by a government to do damage. To me, he says, it seems that the resources needed to stage this attack point to a nation state. He said the code analysis makes it clear that Stuxnet is not about sending a message or providing a concept. It's about destroying its targets with utmost determination in military style. The worm, as I said, may have slowed for a few months, but it is now in the hands of criminal hackers. And Iran, in response to the attack, has recruited its own team of hackers. It's interested in preventing another such attack, but it's also interested in retaliation in case it experiences it again. We seem to be heading into now a cyber arms race as country after country works to develop cyber weapons. We have now discovered that there's a new variation on the Stuxnet called the Duku. Crisis, a lab in Budapest, discovered the program and wrote a 60-page report on it, saying it was nearly identical to Stuxnet but built for a different purpose. It aims to gather information, specifically to steal blueprints and other intellectual property. The invention of Duku as a consequence of Stuxnet has not apparently deterred the United States or the unfortunate consequences of Stuxnet. In 2012, another virus has been detected known as Flame, which appears to be part of the same campaign as Stuxnet. A researcher at Kaspersky Labs brought Flame's existence to public light, saying, "We believe Flame was written by a different team of programmers but commissioned by the same large entity. Like Duku, Flame is an espionage tool. It is spread by Bluetooth. Duku, Flame are apparently easily traced back to the United States because they use processes named after American media, characters like Beetlejuice and Jason Bourne." Okay. Once a cyber weapon is decoded, it just seems to be standard that they're turned into yet new weapons. The Stuxnet virus was intended to only target facilities with a specific layout. However, it was spread by a USB flash drive and other means and quickly spread around the globe. Quote, "Stuxnet spun out of control. Although it was intended to stop the progress of Iran's nuclear program, it also damaged 100,000 computers all over Europe. Cyber weapons are like boomerangs. In a boomerang war, there are no winners. Nevertheless, the United States is putting the lion's share of its military research dollars into cyber weapons. These are being developed under its new Cyber Command, one of the 9 combatant commands of the United States Department of Defense. And of course, similar research programs are multiplying around the world. The third major weapons development of the computer age is the fully autonomous robotic weapon. This weapon depends on computer programs that can learn. Research in artificial intelligence is aiming for a robot that, once constructed and programmed, will be able to make an attack decision without additional human intervention. The idea is to have a robot that will collect audio, video, and sensory data, feed it into its computer program, and when the facts add up, launch the kill attack on its own. Such an attack could occur months or even years after the computer is programmed. There is no doubt that the world's militaries are seeking such weapons. In the U.S., as early as 2005, the Committee on Autonomous Vehicles in Support of Naval Operations wrote, "The Navy and Marine Corps should aggressively exploit the considerable war-fighting benefits offered by autonomous vehicles by acquiring operational experience with current systems and using lessons learned from that experience to develop future AV technologies, operational requirements, and system concepts." At a press briefing in 2007, a spokesman for the U.S. Department of Defense's Unmanned Aerial Systems Task Force spoke of the need to go beyond the remotely controlled technology that requires human intervention. He said, "Certainly the roadmap projects an increasing level of autonomy. To fulfill many of the most stressing requirements requires such advantages." Let me just pick one example, air-to-air combat. There's really no way that a system that's remotely controlled can effectively operate in an offensive or defensive air combat environment. That has to be the requirement that is a fully autonomous system. At its essence, autonomous weapons are those that take the human out of the kill chain. The end goal is that robots will operate autonomously to locate their targets and destroy them without human intervention. We may already have such weapons in our military arsenals, or we will have them in a few years or perhaps a few decades. Some commentators, however, believe it will be many decades. Professor Noah Sharkey has argued that a truly, fully autonomous robotic weapon that learns and can independently select targets will never be developed. Nevertheless, he is in the forefront of the movement to ban killer robots. He has succeeded in moving the parties to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons to workshop the possibility of a new Protocol 6 to ban fully autonomous robotic weapons. And I think this is, of course, the right way to go with any of these weapons, especially the ones we are so uncertain about their future impact. Treaties are the key tool through which the international community has controlled weapons use. We have prohibited blinding laser weapons even before they were fully developed. We have prohibited anti-personnel landmines, cluster munitions, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons, all through treaties. And until the last decade, treaties have also had the support of the way we have conceptualized the battlefield to support the restrictive use of certain highly lethal military weapons. But since 9/11, the U.S. has been pushing a set of arguments to permit the use of military weapons outside the traditionally defined legal battle zone. In 2011, I wrote an article published in the Journal of Law, Information and Science called Seductive Drones, because after careful scrutiny, it became plain to me that the U.S. was engaged in certain lethal operations largely owing to the fact that it had drone technology. The operations in Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan would largely never have been attempted using ground forces, helicopter gunships, or manned aircraft. Not only would those operations have posed significant risk to U.S. personnel, they would be more expensive and would be much more obviously unlawful and difficult to defend to the international community. The U.S.'s current use of drones and cyber weapons depend, however, on a greatly expanded definition of the legal battlefield. It depends on defining armed conflict much more widely so as to be able to use lethal and destructive force under rules that only pertain on the battlefield, instead of the normally prevailing rules on lethal force in peacetime. You see, the problem for the U.S. in using drones or even cyber weapons, the way it has been doing, certainly the Hellfire missile, is that much firepower is only permissible on a battlefield where the rule of necessity that prevails is the rule of military necessity, where you may kill enemy soldiers not because you have a particular necessity to kill that soldier at that time, but because you're in a battlefield situation where any uniformed member of the armed forces of the opposition or civilians who are directly participating in hostilities can be killed at that time with no more specific right to do so. It's only under a rule of necessity of that type that you can drop a bomb on people or fire a missile without care and concern for the individuals that you may be killing. And, of course, on the battlefield, while you may not intentionally target civilians, persons not directly participating in the hostilities, it is tolerable that some civilians may be killed so long as it is not a disproportionate number to the value of the military objective. So again, that rule of proportionality together with the rule of necessity means that you can fire a missile in Afghanistan, kill your intended targets, and perhaps several civilians at the same time. Whereas if you're in a non-combat situation, if you're here in the UK, we don't allow law enforcement, when they're confronting a dangerous situation, to use a missile or drop a bomb. Because in addition to confronting the target of their concern, there's a risk of killing bystanders. And in peacetime situations, the rule of necessity does not permit the killing of bystanders. We have a very clear rule of necessity that governs in the peacetime situation. The European Court of Human Rights, in the case of McCann versus United Kingdom, ruled that the lawful use of lethal force beyond armed conflict hostilities must be, quote, absolutely necessary in the defense of persons from unlawful violence. and similarly, the United Nations Basic Principles for the Use of Force and Firearms by Law Enforcement Officials, which are widely adopted throughout the world, states that law enforcement officials shall not use firearms against persons except in self-defense or defense of others against the imminent threat of death or serious injury to prevent the perpetration of a particularly serious crime involving grave threat to life, to arrest a person presenting such a danger and resisting their authority, or to prevent his or her escape, and only when less extreme measures are insufficient to achieve these objectives. In any event, intentional lethal use of firearms may only be made when strictly unavoidable in order to protect life. Firearms, not missiles, not bombs. So, in targeted assassination of the kind that the U.S. has been pursuing since 9/11 is strictly out. The U.S. recognized this fact and officially observed it until 9/11. In July 2001, just a couple months before the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk, stated on Israeli television in connection with Israeli targeted killing that the United States government is very clearly on the record as against targeted assassination. They are extrajudicial killings, and we do not support that. But after 9/11, the Bush administration wanted the legal cover of certain wartime rules with respect to detention, interrogation, and targeted killing. The U.S. wanted to do more killing than we could do under peacetime rules. We didn't want to say we were just doing this by fiat, without law. We invoked this concept of the global war on terror. President Obama, of course, saw the problem with trying to say we have the right to drop bombs and fire missiles in a global war on terror. There is no global war. There have been world wars stretching over large parts of the earth where there's actual armed conflict fighting of the kind that we recognize in international law as amounting to armed conflict hostilities, intense exchange of organized armed fighting. That is the conclusion of the report that my committee prepared at the International Law Association, the Use of Force Committee. But President Bush wanted to use military force in Yemen, where there were no such armed conflict hostilities. So he said that there was a global war, that there was fighting everywhere based on the presence of an individual who was part of an organized armed group. President Obama said that's ridiculous when he was campaigning for office. When he was elected, and this is one of the great mysteries that I hope some of you who are political scientists can work on and enlighten us, something happened to him between Election Day in November, Inauguration Day in January, because within 3 days of being inaugurated, he authorized the first targeted killing in Pakistan, in which a number of people were killed, including several small children. In the course of that year, his first year in office, 2009, he authorized twice the number of targeted killings with drones in Pakistan as his predecessor, President Bush. So some of us did, as Russell said, I tried to challenge, others tried to challenge the U.S. government for on what possible basis of law they were carrying out these targeted killings. And we were told that while it was not a global war on terror, the United States was involved in an armed conflict against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces wherever they were. And with all due respect for the lawyers in the Obama administration, I really see no difference between that attempted argument and the argument that President Obama dismissed out of hand, that we're in some kind of global war on terror. But things have actually gotten even more complex and, for me, even more worrying in terms of where we're going with what we see as war and when we can use military force. And that is the Obama lawyers, perhaps because they see the weakness of this argument of global war, or perhaps because they're trying to attack people who have nothing even to do with Al-Qaeda or associated forces. But they have come up with 2 more attempts to argue why they have the right to use drone attacks beyond the one place where the U.S. is involved in armed conflict combat right now, which is Afghanistan. First, they've argued that they can go against individuals who might in the future launch an armed attack on the United States under the UN Charter's right of self-defense. Well, this is an extreme argument, extremely fallacious. Under the UN Charter, yes, states may have the right to go. States do have the right to go to self-defense if they have experienced an armed attack that is significant, and they launch their self-defense against a state that is responsible for that armed attack under the law of state responsibility. That's where they carry out their defense. That's where they get their defensive protection against a state responsible for the armed attack. International law has two more rules with regard to that exercise of self-defense by the victim. The exercise has to be necessary, yet another rule of necessity, this time in launching your war of self-defense. You have to be able to secure your defensive purpose under the necessity rule in the jus ad bellum or resort to force. If it's one-off potential attack by a terrorist like Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, who may in the future try to put a bomb on a cargo plane, you do not have evidence of what it's going to take to defend. And of course that's too insignificant, not the responsibility of Yemen, and there's simply no right to use military force as opposed to law enforcement. The third argument, and I'm speeding to my conclusion in the discussion of the future of war, is an argument that President Obama mentioned in his speech in May at the National Defense University when he said, okay, well, we may have a problem with global war, we may have a problem with trying to say we have the right to resort to military force in self-defense against these characters, but we can use and exercise military force on the territory of a foreign sovereign state that is unable or unwilling to control a problem of terrorism on their territory. As if this was a new right in international law to resort to military force. There is no such right. You can resort to military force in self-defense, as I just discussed, with Security Council authorization, or perhaps to join with a government in effective control that is attempting to put down a rebellion, as the US and UK are doing in Afghanistan, with the invitation of that government. There's no right if a country's having trouble controlling militancy and lawlessness on its territory. This idea was first developed at the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, Chatham House, but it's not based on any treaty, customary rule of international law, general principle. There's simply no right to go to war on another state's territory because it's unable or unwilling. The most you could do is carry out law enforcement actions on that state's territory because they haven't done anything to trigger the right of resort to military force. But I see this particular argument, unable or unwilling, as moving us into the peacetime law enforcement paradigm taking along military force. I see that this is a position that the U.S. is trying to push, that we have new types of battlefields, that we have the right to use this heightened level of force in fundamentally law enforcement situations. The use of Stuxnet equally relies on flipping the legal order, allowing military force in these law enforcement or criminal settings. Iran had done nothing for which the U.S. and Israel had the right to attack it. That kind of attack could only be appropriate in a war-fighting military force setting. You can imagine how useful, again, this flipping of the war and peace situation will be to using fully autonomous robotic weapons that are programmed to use lethal force, military force, months or years in the future. Thanks to all this new weapons technology, I think we're at risk of believing that the force prohibited in the UN Charter is only boots on the ground, traditional military invasion, as President Obama puts it. We're risking regularizing the view that if drone-launched missiles are acceptable for law enforcement problems such as terrorism, Why not use drone attacks in law enforcement, as China considered doing in the case of the criminal in Myanmar? In fact, we've seen very little outrage, protest, arguments against this new conceptualization and regularization of use of these high-tech weapons for really using military force, but in this new setting where only law enforcement would be appropriate. And in fact, in this country, the former legal advisor of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Daniel Bethlehem, has proposed just such a scenario going forward in a recent article in the American Journal of International Law, that against terrorists, the problem group he wants to attack, we should be able to use military force regardless of the legal, factual situation in which we find terrorist suspects. So, if this is the way we're going, instead of, but it's really not necessary to lower the barrier to going to war, to using this military force in so many widespread settings. We could actually do the opposite. Because of this new weapons technology that's going to be so widely available, instead of raising the barrier to its use so that we're finding this is the norm, using military force, when before 9/11 we would have used law enforcement measures, doesn't this same set of facts suggest that we need to start characterizing everything as a peacetime situation and require a necessity rule for any resort to force, regardless of the type of force? So instead of thinking about the fact that somebody is a terrorist and may have been involved in fighting in Afghanistan, or let's even go to Afghanistan, going forward, let's think about the individual fighter in Afghanistan. Right now, if that person is walking down the road with their weapon, they've just come from a firefight, and our forces know that they are a military person who has been fighting, they can shoot that person in the back. A proposal made in the 1990s, and that I think we have to look at seriously now, is that any use of lethal force, even on a recognized battlefield, should be on the basis of necessity. Is there really a necessity to use lethal force against that individual right now, or is there an alternative that would work? If we start using that peacetime rule of necessity, do you have to use necessary force in this situation, then we will restrict actual use of major force, major weaponry, to real battlefields. And to terrorists who are operating in small groups, who are plotting future plots, will be subject to the necessity principle that prevails in peacetime right now. So instead of going to a far more dangerous world, we could be looking at a far more peaceful one. Instead of a war norm, looking at these, applying the peace necessity rule, will lead to the decline of the right to use these weapons to very rare situations. And we'll have the added benefit, not only of creating a world that I think is much more commensurate with our moral and ethical beliefs and the aim of law generally, which is to create a more peaceful world and settle disputes without violence, we'll actually find that we will address the problem of terrorism, the problem of governance, so many of the problems we face today far more effectively, because we find that military force is not a very effective approach to most of the complicated problems we face. Let me just remind you that the U.S. started using drones in 2002. It is 2014. When a general in charge of the National Security, National Intelligence Agency, part of the National Security Agency structure in the U.S., was asked by Congress last week if the U.S. was gaining a victory over Al-Qaeda, he said no. After 12 and a half years of constant killing, stretching the rules of international law to try to justify the use of military force in places it was never intended to use, That general said, Al-Qaeda is simply morphing, it is changing, it is drawing recruits because of the way we have approached this problem. Military force is not an effective approach. So let's go back to these proposals of saying that lethal force should only be used in situations of necessity. That is the way forward to a future with far less war. Of course, I dream of a future with no war, but this alternative, just because we have drones, because we have cyber weapons, because we're going to get fully autonomous robotic weapons, we've got to be able to use them and create a situation where all the world is one of war with occasional pockets of peace. It's a disaster for your future. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Adam, you're running around with the microphone, is that right? Great. So, do we have any questions? Anyone want to be the standard bearer? Looks like you're the standard bearer. Can you bring him the mic just so we can hear, so they can hear him? We'll hear him fine, but they won't hear us that bad. And the camera won't hear me.
Hi, I'm a philosopher, not a lawyer, so we hopefully won't be cross purposes. Could I just get more sense of whether and to what extent you think, am I audible?
Yes.
To what extent you think drones are special? Because one might well think they're not. If we are fighting a just war, and I want to attack a legitimate military target, and all the relevant boxes of using venerable, necessity, proportionality, they're all ticked, I can't see any reason why there would be a problem about me attacking that target with a drone as opposed to with a tank or by dropping bombs from the sky. You sometimes hear an argument half-aired that somehow it's unsporting not to put your own troops at risk, but that doesn't seem to me to be a good argument. On the other hand, if those boxes aren't getting ticked, if you don't have necessity, you don't have proportionality, if it's in the wrong place, if it's not a battlefield, then there's a problem with killing people with drones. But the problem isn't that you're using drones, the problem is that you're killing people in unlawful ways. And I'm not sure how relevant that is to your talk, because it wasn't always quite clear to me whether what you were saying is, look, we use special legal instruments to regulate the use of drones, because these are problematic in a new way, or rather that what we need is more clarity about the way our existing legal instruments apply to the use of drones, no less than to other kinds of files.
No, it's a very appropriate question, and I appreciate the chance to clarify some more. I'm married to a combat veteran, and I'm all in favor of protecting troops on the battlefield. So I began my study of drone use with the view that as long as you're on the battlefield, this is not a problematic weapon. In fact, it's one that I think we can actually get more civilian protection, and I fully concur with protecting our own forces. However, after 12 and a half years of watching 2 U.S. presidents using drones and seeing how interested leaders are of other groups like Hamas and in China, etc., I'm far more skeptical about the drone just being another kind of weapon. It has a distinctive and dramatic difference from every other kind of weapon we've been using in that it does not put that leader's own people at risk. And that means that he can get away with using it without having to answer to the public in the same way as with other battlefield decisions or decisions to deploy. And it has led to this real interest in similar kinds of weapons that seem to be so cost-free for the leader. And as a result, we in international law no longer have any real price to pay to put on the unlawful use of these weapons. And that's why I think drones have been used very extensively. I think the lives of 4,000 people is an extensive, unlawful use of this weapon. How can we get it back into the legal box when it has this seductive quality where presidents are convinced by their security people that they can look tough at the box office, or the ballot box, seems like the box office sometimes, the ballot box, seem tough, Democrats in the US, young presidents, seem to be weak unless they can show that they're killing a lot of people. How can we explain to them that, killing people unlawfully this way has to stop, and to lawfully use these future weapons? The rule of necessity, which at the end of the Cold War, certain human rights authors thought we could have this uniform rule of necessity that all uses of lethal force should be justified for the particular need at the time, and not the way we allow battlefield necessity, the lax, slack right to not make a particularized necessity judgment. If we are going into no longer into these set-piece battles, army against army, where the necessity rule grew up, because you don't have to have very specialized discernment to kill that incoming phalanx of soldiers coming at you, the Iraqi Republican Guard in formation, you do need it if you're fighting with civilians who are directly participating in hostilities, and then they've dropped their weapon and run away. If they're running away, do you really need to fire on them? Can't you capture them? It's that very useful rule of necessity that I think we can ratchet up. It's not asking for a whole new set of rules. It's really asking for a more robust application of the rule of necessity to all lethal force operations. I think that's going to be the best way to back up, in addition, whatever Professor Sharkey can do in terms of a treaty, perhaps. But I would much rather say, if you don't have a rule of necessity that allows you to kill in that situation, you don't do it. I think it's a much brighter line, better way to both keep this technology when it's useful and restrain it when it's not. I hope that helps.
Okay, any other questions from the field? Don't be shy. Over there, Adam. Yeah, the girl with the glasses and the black hair. I can't see her face, but I see her hair.
Hello. Do you think that it would take a serious and severe drone attack on America for them to finally oppose the use of drones?
I hope not. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is how we're going to get to the next level of restraint on the use of force. I've been very depressed thinking about the fact that the current rules on use of force, the basic restraint on resort to war, is in the UN Charter, Article 2.4. That rule was written in 1945. Almost 70 years later, we, the world community, have not added a single word of increased restraint on resort to military force. Nothing in 70 years. We are slackers. It's just depressing. Every generation before us. But the sad thing is, we've always made our moves forward after some terrible disaster. The Second World War, the First World War, the Franco-Prussian War, the American Civil War. Can't we learn that we should move forward toward greater peace, to focusing our resources on the natural environment, on human rights, on prosperity, and not waste our time, our money, and risk our immortal souls with this constant use of killing? Why can't we move forward without a disaster? Why can't we use our common sense? And this is a great question for me. I hope it will not take some kind of disaster before the American people will say enough. And I actually do think there are a number of excellent documentaries now showing the plight of people who have been victims of drone attacks. Young children seeing their grandmother killed in a field right in front of them in a peaceful situation where she was gathering vegetables. Americans are, not hard-hearted. Now, our members of Congress, they are a different story. And I truly, we're all rather puzzled about them. So, just not on this drone issue, but I am hoping, and I don't understand why countries not caught up in this killing, like this country. There has only been one official government protest against U.S. drone killing, and that was by Sweden's Foreign Minister, Anna Lindh, after the 2002 killing and after the UN report, and she was murdered a few months later while out shopping in a department store in Stockholm. That's it. Germany, who prides itself on being such a great paragon of international law, Costa Rica doesn't even have a military, they're so pacific. Where are the protests? Where are the countries saying, we don't want this open-ended slide toward everything being appropriate for the use of military force just because you can do it without your own people being threatened immediately, because I think the threat does develop. I mean, you can look at the statistics. What country is the #1 most hated country in Pakistan? Is it the traditional enemy India? Is it China? Is it Afghanistan? No, it's the United States. So this is really not helping us, but I hope all of you will contact your member of parliament, your prime minister, and ask why this country isn't demanding that its close ally that has stood by in all these wars isn't held to account on its drone policy. So maybe we can avoid America only learning when it's the result of many of my countrymen, my family members, myself being killed. So let's hope for that.
Let's do, well, we're running, so we have one more left.
No, we can do 2. I'll give short answers.
Short answers. There's so many. Well, you're going to dinner, so you can ask that. There's a girl in the blue here from Politics 223. I'm pretty sure.
Thanks. Firstly, I find it really distressing that we can fill a whole talk about the different ways to kill people. So that's quite saddening. But focusing on the automated weapons, the ones that you mentioned last, as with most technology, I mean, it's going to be outdated very easily. So we're presumably going to be spending millions, if not billions, every single year more on updating it. Has the US government tried to legitimate that in any way instead of spending it on reducing poverty or increasing basic rights for people around the world?
Well, I mean, these are decisions that should be up to we the voters. We should not have to have our resources wasted this way. Especially now that there's this new movement to ban fully autonomous robotic weapons, it is an argument to make to our elected representatives to say, look, we are very unlikely to ever get to use this technology. There is a serious ethical, moral, and legal question about a computer program getting to decide on its own to kill people. And we would rather that our high-tech R&D be spent on saving the planet from climate change, making sure that people have good and healthy food, that the superbugs being born of climate change, these would be great places to do R&D. And frankly, if you think about it, why does the United Kingdom even need a military? Why does the United Kingdom need a military? Did the United Kingdom need to invade Iraq in 2003? So why there is so much spending just because of tradition? These are the kinds of ideas, the kinds of way forward in terms of moving beyond militarism that we the voters should be able to start impressing on our. I know. Did that sound? Everyone got a little bit quiet. The United States doesn't need a military. if we had responded to 9/11 the way that other countries had responded to terrorism problems, the way this country responded after a false start, but eventually quite effectively through law enforcement measures to the IRA, I believe that the answer to the generals, to the answer from the congressman by the general would have been, yes, we have basically dismantled Al-Qaeda and its ideology. If we had used law enforcement instead of military force, I think we would have arrested Osama bin Laden much sooner. I know this is not a short answer. All right, that's the end of my answer. One more question.
Okay, one more
Thank
question. You short, you're it, man. You're the guy.
This is it.
You're the person.
Short question, short
Leave us with
answer.
something great.
Well, my question is kind of different. I was wondering whether there are some positive things about using drones, and I think that it's going to lead to less casualties, will be more cost effective. I'm talking here about, like, in terms of responsibility to protect and peacekeeping interventions, things like that. I mean, the UN, I know that the UN has approved of UN troops assisting in offensive operations in Western Africa.
Yeah, actually, so we're all going to have drones in our lives all the time, and this is something we need to be concerned about, because the fact that our Christmas presents are going to be delivered by Amazon by drone is part of what will seduce us into thinking that this is normal, and if it's delivering a Christmas gift or a missile, it's all fine. So we really have to be aware of what this new technology is doing to our perception. However, and so using drones to monitor conflictual situations and get data back for the delivery of food aid, that's all to the good. But I have to tell you, the idea of R2P is in military force to help human rights. This is a contradiction in terms. There are much better ways to promote human rights than lethal force. And that'll be my last word, and thank you very much for the great questions.